Um, Hello, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure this afternoon introduce Professor Ifat Levy. Currently, she is an associate professor of psychology at Yale University, as well as an associate professor of comparative medicine and neuroscience at Yale University School of Medicine. Professor Levy obtained her Bachelor's of Science and Bachelor's of Law at Tel Aviv University, then her PhD in computational neuroscience at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She wears many hats within her life. After graduate school, Professor Levy conducted postdoctoral research with Paul Glincher at New York University. Her research now focuses on decision-making under uncertainty and on value learning and encoding. Throughout her career, she has received research support and funding from the NIH and National Science Foundation. Additionally, she has published over 40 academic journal articles, including publications in Trends in Cognitive Science, Biological Psychiatry, and Molecular Psychiatry. She is also a reviewing editor for eNeuro and an associate editor for the Journal of Neuroscience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ifat Levy.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be here. My lab is interested in decision-making under uncertainty. And if you think about it, uncertainty is really everywhere. Every decision that we make has some kind of uncertainty in it. These are just a few examples from the news in the last few years, especially with the pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty, economic uncertainty, of course, medical uncertainty, and also political uncertainty. And as you know, there are huge individual differences in how people treat uncertainty, how they feel or think about uncertainty. Some people would rather avoid uncertainty at all costs, not take any chances, while others embrace uncertainty and take a lot of risks. Individual attitudes towards uncertainty are also related to the tendency to develop psychopathology. So there is evidence for intolerance of uncertainty in obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety and depression, social anxiety disorder. It has actually been suggested that intolerance of uncertainty can be a transdiagnostic mechanism of psychological difficulties. There's also the opposite phenomenon in disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. People seem to actually be more tolerant of uncertainty or take more risks. My lab is particularly interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is a very prevalent disorder in the population, especially in combat veterans. It is a very heterogeneous disorder. It consists of a wide range of different symptoms. And as a result, it's kind of difficult to study it. On the one hand, many different combinations of symptoms may lead to diagnosis of PTSD. On the other hand, it is highly comorbid with other disorders like depression. And a lot of research of PTSD focuses on fear mechanisms. These are just a few examples, including from our group. And fear mechanisms are, of course, very important in the structure of PTSD. But implied in the fear conditioning tasks that we use in this kind of research is that there's a lot of uncertainty around this learning, around the learned associations. Typically, subjects learn to associate cues such as a blue square with either danger, for example, electric shock, or safety, no electric shock. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not these outcomes are going to happen. And so individual attitudes towards uncertainty might also play a role in PTSD. Now, our lab uses neuroeconomics techniques and ideas. And one of the ideas that were very useful for us is the distinction that behavioral economics makes between different types of uncertainty. Think about these two images. Anybody recognizes them? I'm sure that most of you do. On the left is a flu virus. On the right is the coronavirus. And this is a slide that I first put together in the beginning of the pandemic in one of the talks that I gave. And at that time, we knew quite a lot about flu, right? Because we have a lot of experience with it. We know the symptoms, we know the statistics, about 0.1% death rate, vaccine effectiveness is about 50%. At that time, we didn't really know much about the coronavirus. We're only learning to know the symptoms. We didn't know what the death rate was. There was no vaccine. We didn't know if there would be one and what the effectiveness of the vaccine would be when there is one. So economists call this kind of uncertainty risk. There's a lot of uncertainty. If the vaccine is only 50% effective, then if you get the flu shot, there is 50% chance to get the flu if you encounter it. But we know the probabilities for getting the flu if we get the shot. So the probabilities of different outcomes are known. With the coronavirus, there's a lot of ambiguity. This is what economists call a situation where the probabilities for different outcomes are not known. Of course, when we get more and more information, more and more experience with the coronavirus, with the COVID-19 pandemic, this ambiguity turns into risk, right? We now have a better idea of what the death rate is. We know what the vaccine effectiveness is. And so we turn ambiguity into risk. But these two types of uncertainty, risk and ambiguity, turned out to be very useful in studying decision-making under uncertainty. And in the lab, we can study these types of uncertainty. We just monitor lotteries that are much simpler than the viruses. So think about these as two errands that contain chips, plastic chips, red and blue. On the left, this is a risky situation because you know that there are 50% red chips and 50% blue chips. And I'm telling you that if you draw a red chip, you'll get $100. If you draw a blue chip, you'll get nothing. So you have a 50% chance of getting $100. On the right, this is an ambiguous case. You also know that there are red and blue chips in it, but you don't know how many are red and how many are blue. So the probability for getting $110 in this case is unknown. So you have a chance to get more money on the right, but you don't know what this chance is. And in a typical experiment in the lab, either in a behavioral experiment or with functional MRI or other techniques, subjects see a series of choices like this. What would you rather have? 50% chance of $10 or $5 for sure. Someone who's risk averse would go for the $5. Someone who's risk seeking might go for the $10, 50% chance of $10. Others maybe will be debating. And we can change the amount of money that we offer with the lottery. So at some point, everybody will switch from the $5 for sure to the risky lottery. We can also change the probability for different outcomes. And by changing these parameters, the amount and probability, we can estimate how risk averse or risk seeking each of our participants is. We can also estimate their attitudes toward ambiguity by hiding some of the information. So in this case, you don't know what's behind the gray occluder. It could be all red, all blue, any combination of red and blue. So you know in this case, there is at least 25% chance of getting $10 if you choose the ambiguous lottery, and at least 25% chance of getting nothing, but you don't know what's in between. And again, we can change the level of ambiguity, how much of the information is hidden, and by that we can estimate individual ambiguity attitudes. And we can take the behavior for subjects and model it. The model itself is not really important. I can talk about it more if anyone is interested. What's important is that in order to model the behavior and find some compact representation of the behavior, we assume some kind of functional form for the subjective value of each option that our subjects consider. We say, okay, the subjective value is affected by all of these objective characteristics of the trial, by the amount that it offers, by the probability for getting the amount, by the level of ambiguity, how much of the information is hidden. And it's also affected by individual parameters, how risk averse or risk seeking each subject is, and how ambiguity averse or ambiguity seeking they are. So we can use these estimations of subjective value in a choice function. Basically, the idea is that subjects calculate subjective values for different options and then choose the option of the higher value. And the way we do the fitting process is we just look for the parameters, these alpha and beta risk and ambiguity attitudes that best describe each participant's behavior. So we want to get, in an iterative way, we want to get to these parameters that are right for each subject. By the way, if there are any questions, feel free to ask me if anything is unclear. And this is just one of our data sets from the lab, but it's similar to what other labs report as well. These are individual risk and ambiguity attitudes, risk attitude on the x-axis, ambiguity attitude on the y-axis. And you can see that there's a lot of variability in these individual attitudes, and that there doesn't seem to be strong correlation between risk and ambiguity attitudes across individuals. So these may be two independent, or at least somewhat independent processes, characteristics that are interesting to look at if we're interested in individual differences and in how individual differences in behavior under uncertainty relate to things like psychopathology. Okay, so what I've said so far is that decision-making under uncertainty is important. There are a lot of individual differences in it, and that we have some tools coming from behavioral economics to look at these individual differences. And what I'm going to present today are three questions that we asked and are still asking in the lab about these individual differences. So first, is there some neurobiological marker for the individual differences that we observe behaviorally? Second, are variations in decision-making under uncertainty can be observed in trauma-related psychopathology? And finally, can we study decision-making under uncertainty with non-quantifiable outcomes? So again, I showed you this graph, a lot of variability. And one of the first questions that we asked is, what could predict or be associated with this variability when we look at the neurobiology? And this is in collaboration with Sharon Gilai-Dotan, who is now an assistant professor in Israel. She's an expert on voxel-based morphometry. What's voxel-based morphometry? It simply means that you can take an anatomical MRI of a subject and you can look for changes in gray matter volume or associations between gray matter volumes in different locations and some behavioral characteristics or individual trait or ability. And we started with this technique because a lot of research in recent years has shown that you can find correlates of individual traits and preferences in the brain, in the structure of the brain. And so we thought that it would make sense that if risk attitude or ambiguity attitudes are indeed individual traits, they would be reflected in some kind of structural measure. And so we had a group of subjects that did a task just like what I showed you. So they made a bunch of choices with risky and ambiguous options. And they also had an anatomical MRI of their brains. And then Sharon was looking for areas in the brain whose gray matter volume was correlated with the risk attitude of the subject. And she found this area here. This is the only area she found in a whole brain analysis. This is posterior parietal cortex, the right posterior parietal cortex. And activity in this area was correlated with the volume, such that more volume was associated with more risk tolerance or less risk aversion. Now, this is a small group of subjects, so that's not enough to claim something. And so we also got another data set from the lab of Joe Cable in UPenn. And then Sharon went exactly to the same region of interest in posterior parietal cortex and predicted individual risk attitudes based on this area in their brain and got significant predictions. I'm not showing it here, but as a control, we also used a control area in the vicinity of primary motor cortex, and we weren't able to make significant predictions. So it is something about, it seemed that it is something about this particular brain area. Now, this finding suggested to us that it might be interesting to look at aging and what happens in aging in the neurobiology and the behavior, because as I'm sure you know, gray matter volume diminishes with age, basically all over the brain. And there is a lot of research that looked at decision-making in older adults, but results are mixed. So some studies find increased risk aversion in aging, and others actually report increased risk seeking. But it seems that in the kind of task or in the kind of decisions that I've shown you, when the choice is between a risky monetary option and a safe option, there are several reports, including from our lab, that older adults are more risk averse compared to young adults. And this is what I plotted here from our study. The way it's plotted here is that negative numbers indicate risk aversion. And you can see that young adults, midlife adults, and older adults are all risk averse on average, but older adults more so than the younger adults. So we were interested in seeing whether we can find, whether we can explain this increase in risk aversion with age with a neurobiology. And this is the work of Michael Grab, who's here. And so he scanned a large number of subjects, over 50 subjects of a wide range of ages between 18 and 88. And first of all, show that as expected, this area in posterior parietal cortex in the brains of these subjects indeed shows diminishing gray matter volume. He also replicated a previous result showing that with age, there is decrease in risk tolerance or increase in risk aversion. But his important finding was that if you include the volume of posterior parietal cortex in your model, there is no longer significant association between age and risk tolerance. In other words, the neurobiology explains the behavioral changes more or better than age per se. So far what we saw is that the structure of posterior parietal cortex predicts risk tolerance in 3 different data sets. That this structure accounts for age-related decrease in risk tolerance, and that's what we saw. And I'm also telling you that in a separate study from the lab of Joe Cable, they found that the structural and functional connectivity patterns of the amygdala also predict risk attitudes across individuals. So taking all of these together may suggest that risk attitude is at least to some extent a trait rather than a state. If it was a state, we wouldn't find something stable in the brain that predicts it. Now, we didn't find anything similar for ambiguity. We did look a lot, and there might be many reasons why we didn't find it. We can talk about it more if anyone is interested. One explanation is that maybe ambiguity attitude is more a state than a trait compared to risk attitude. But I'm not sure that, we don't have good evidence for that right now. That's just one of several possible explanations. Okay, so moving to the next part, I started in the beginning talking about psychopathology and especially post-traumatic stress disorder. If you think about it, traumatic events are often surrounded by uncertainty, and especially if you think about combat veterans. There are high levels of uncertainty in the battlefield. People who go to battle know that very bad things may happen, but there's a lot of ambiguity about these potential outcomes. You can't really estimate the chances for something bad happening. So we thought that it was possible that someone who's intolerant of uncertainty, when something terrible happens to them, when they encounter trauma, may be more impacted by the trauma compared to someone who's more tolerant to uncertainty, and may be more likely to develop PTSD symptoms. Could also go in the opposite direction. Could be that after developing PTSD symptoms, the person associates their symptoms with the high levels of uncertainty that they experience and become more averse to uncertainty. Either way, we thought that there should be, or there would be, a link between uncertainty attitudes and PTSD symptoms. Now, in order to look at this, we added to our experiments a loss condition. So we thought it was very important to look at choices between losses because we're thinking about negative outcomes. It's very simple, just the same design as before, but now some of the choices are between potential losses. Lose $5 for sure, or take a chance of losing more than $5. And interestingly, just as I showed you before that there is very little correlation between risk and ambiguity attitudes, there is also very little correlation between risk attitudes in the gains and losses domain, or ambiguity attitudes in the gains and losses domain. So all of these four traits or four characteristics, risk and ambiguity in the gain and loss domains, seem to be quite independent. So it's interesting to look at all of them when we're interested in psychopathology. So what we asked here is whether trauma-related psychopathology is associated with individual differences in uncertainty attitudes and their neural mechanisms. And if so, are any differences specific to the loss domain or more general? And this is the first study, which is just behavioral. Subjects made all of these different choices, and then we characterized their attitudes towards risk and ambiguity in the gain and loss domain. These were all combat veterans, so they all experienced some kind of trauma, but about half of them developed PTSD, so their symptoms rose to the level of diagnosis of PTSD. The others did not, although they did have, some of them did have some symptoms as well. When we compare the groups, when we looked at risk attitudes, there's absolutely no difference. There's also no difference in ambiguity attitudes when making choices between gains. But when these subjects made choices between losses, individuals with PTSD were more averse to ambiguity compared to combat controls. Now, interestingly, I haven't shown this to you, but when we did a similar study in the general population, we saw a pattern similar to that of combat controls. So individuals in the general population did not show ambiguity aversion in the loss domain, only in the gain domain. So there may be something specific in ambiguous losses where the processing of these ambiguous losses or this ambiguity condition is different on average with in individuals with PTSD. So we got interested in the neural mechanisms of these differences, and this is a project that was led by a former graduate student in the lab, Ron and Gia. In this project, we scanned combat veterans. We report here the male veterans because we had a very small number of female veterans. They went through a lot of clinical characterization. This is in collaboration with clinicians at the West Haven VA. But most importantly here is that they were assessed with the CAPS, the clinical clinician-administered PTSD scale, which is the gold standard for diagnosing PTSD. And just to show you the wide range of symptoms in our subjects, this is the total symptoms in all of our subjects. You see it going all the way from nothing to very severe symptoms. And then if you look at the different clusters of symptoms, like re-experiencing the traumatic event, or feeling kind of numb, or feeling anxious arousal, there's a lot of variability in all of these symptoms across our subjects. So these subjects participated in a functional MRI experiment. So they did a task with the risky and ambiguous choices while lying in an MRI machine. And so first we looked at their behavior, and we're mostly interested, of course, in ambiguous losses, the condition that we saw an effect with before. And we saw a similar effect here. So this is, rather than comparing group, what I'm showing here is a continuous representation of all of our subjects. X-axis is the symptom severity. Y-axis is the ambiguity attitude, where positive numbers are ambiguity seeking, negative numbers are ambiguity aversion. And you can see that subjects become more or are more averse to ambiguity in the loss domain as symptoms increase. Interestingly, in this data set, we also found an effect with risky gains. So where probabilities are known, but the choice is between gains, subjects with higher symptoms also seem to be more risk averse than subjects with lower symptoms. Okay, so this was just behavior, but really what we're interested in here is the brain. And the first thing we did is we just looked at general activation. General activation is the activation in the brain while subjects are doing anything, seeing the stimuli, making choices, compared to intertrial intervals. So we just took this general activation and we searched for correlation with symptoms across subjects. And we found these two areas, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex here and ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And if you're familiar with fMRI studies, usually there is a tendency to plot positive correlation in red and negative correlation in blue. So that's what we see here. Increased activation as a function of symptoms in this dorsal area, decreased activation in the ventral area. And when you look at the different conditions, ambiguous and risky gains and losses, you see that these effects are consistent across the four conditions. So it's not that they're driven by losses or by ambiguity. It's actually a consistent reduction in activation, or activation becomes more negative with symptoms in all four conditions, and then the opposite in dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And these areas, DMPFC and VMPFC, have been implicated in PTSD before. This is a meta-analysis showing similar areas. But the studies that have implicated these areas are usually directly related to the trauma, to either use fearful faces, electric shocks, things that are related to fear, trauma, negative things. We used a simple economic decision-making task with money, nothing related to the trauma whatsoever, and we still saw similar effects. So it seems that there might be something more general that is different in the activity of these areas in these individuals. Okay, but what do these areas do? So they do a lot of things, obviously, but as neuroeconomists, the first thing that comes to mind is that they're involved in value computation. This is, for example, a meta-analysis from the lab of Joe Cable, showing these areas you can see here, all the way from ventral to dorsal medial prefrontal. These areas are involved or thought to be involved in value encoding. And so the next thing that we did, we said, why don't we look directly at value encoding? And remember, we have this model for calculating subjective value of each trial that our subjects experienced. So now we know based on their behavior that we know their risk and ambiguity attitudes, and we can plug it in together with the parameters of each trial. What was the amount? What was the probability? What was the ambiguity level? And calculate the subjective value. And then we can search where in the brain we see correlation between activity and subjective value. Okay. And we first did it across all of our subjects, regardless of symptoms. And we did it in the gain domain separately for ambiguous and risky trials. What we found here is really textbook value encoding. So you see again, the VMPFC going up to the DMPFC, and then the other areas that are part of the valuation system are ventral striatum and also posterior cingulate cortex. You can see a little bit here and here. So this is exactly what you would expect. Based on the meta-analysis and kind of the consensus in the field, we expected to see similar maps for losses as well, but that's not what we saw. So if you compare these two maps, under losses, representation of values seem to be much more lateral in posterior parietal cortex and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this is something that we're still studying in ongoing work. But when we first got these results, we realized that actually maybe it's not that surprising There's kind of a consensus in the field that value is encoded in a unified way in a single valuation system, but really there isn't much evidence showing that specifically for gains and losses. There is one very well-known paper from Russ Poldrack that shows this, but then there are also several other papers that show separation between gains and losses. And I'm happy to talk more later about why this is interesting. But I think we have some evidence here that gains and losses are not necessarily or not completely overlapping in the brain. But of course, this was all across all of our subjects, regardless of symptoms, and we're really interested in symptoms here. So the next thing we did is we divided subjects into those with PTSD and those without PTSD. And we focused on the two conditions where we saw behavioral differences, so ambiguous losses and risky gains. And you can see that the picture is very different. Now, this is qualitative results. This is not quantitative, but this suggests, I think, interesting areas for future research. In ambiguity, the pattern that we saw across all subjects is really driven by the controls. In the individuals with PTSD, we don't see it. If anything, we see here in anterior temporal cortex, negative correlation with subjective value. So reduced activation as subjective value increases. We also see a different pattern of activation for risky gains. And here, those with PTSD are actually the ones driving the common pattern and the one that you would expect from the general population. Individuals, the combat controls subjects, even at a relatively lenient threshold, did not show the same pattern of activation. Now, this is a speculation, but I think this could be potentially very interesting because what we have here is patients with or individuals with PTSD are similar to the general population. The controls, those who experienced trauma and didn't develop PTSD, are the ones who are different. So maybe we have some hint towards some kind of resiliency mechanisms that these individuals have. And this is still something that needs research, but I think an interesting initial result. Just to look at it more quantitatively, we also look to the value areas from the meta-analysis that I mentioned before, VMPFC, ventral striatum. And you can see that that there is an effect of symptoms. X-axis is symptoms. We basically just went to this region of interest. We sampled the activity and we asked, what is the correlation between symptoms and activity, or the level of encoding of subjective value in this subject. And you see that there is increased encoding of the subjective value of risky gains with increasing symptoms, but decreasing representation in the ambiguous losses condition. And I know that this all may be a little bit confusing, but I want you to just focus on this result because I think that's the interesting one. If you look here, it's not just that the effect of subjective value is reduced with symptoms, it actually switches from positive to negative. So there is positive correlation with subjective value in this area when you have low symptoms, but negative correlation for high symptoms. And this got us thinking about the differences between encoding value and encoding saliency. So value is how good or bad something is. Value is monotonic. If you go from punishment to reward, encoding of value would show high activity for high reward and low activity for high punishment. Saliency has this U shape. So it will show high activity both for high reward and for high punishment. And there are different studies looking at encoding of value and saliency. And one interesting thing is that in the ventral striatum, there is evidence for encoding of both value and saliency. So value is how good or bad something is. Saliency is how important it is, how much the organism or the human has to be alerted and to note it. And so this mixed representation might serve different different goals for the animal. This is from one of our studies, but there is a similar result from Antonio Rengel's lab. And so the switch that we saw from positive to negative representation of value in ventral striatum reminded us of these results. And so then Ronan went and looked directly at encoding of value and encoding of saliency. So simply looked for correlation with this monotonic representation of value and correlation with this U-shaped measure of value or saliency. And what she found is that indeed there is increased representation of value in the controls and increased representation of saliency in the individuals with PTSD. Again, this needs a lot of further research, but it's interesting because it's kind of reminiscent of prior research in animals where in mice and rats, people have shown that stress leads to differences in valence encoding or affects valence encoding. So it could be that we're seeing something similar in our human subjects, but again, that's at the level of a speculation. Okay, so there are some differences both in behavior and in the neural mechanisms of decision-making under uncertainty in PTSD. But these differences do not seem to be specific to the loss domain. And I think that's important because a lot of the research of PTSD focuses on negative things. But if you look at the symptoms, some of the symptoms like numbing and hedonia are actually related to reward. There are more research now that look at reward as well. And I think that's a really good direction that should continue. Okay. So this was one result, just to let you know, the ambiguity attitudes that we saw kind of might be important in PTSD. Ambiguity attitudes specifically have been observed in other disorders as associated with symptoms. So in OCD, antisocial personality disorder, schizophrenia, autism. And this is a recent result from Anna Canova and Silvia Lopez Guzman in the lab of Paul Blimcher, showing that changes in ambiguity or increased ambiguity tolerance in opioid users predicted further subsequent relapse. So they actually, Anna and Silvia actually went to a clinic where people were going through treatment for opioid use, and they repeatedly administered a risk and ambiguity task and showed that there were slight changes in ambiguity attitudes between sessions. And when they observed increased tolerance to ambiguity, they could predict use of opioids. So again, going in the same direction of maybe ambiguity attitudes are more of a state than a trait, whereas risk attitudes were very consistent across the sessions here. So maybe they're more like a trait. Now, not sure, we have 15 minutes. I have one small part, so should I? Okay. Okay, so the last part is everything I've shown you so far is with monetary decisions. And monetary decisions are useful because most people or most everybody prefer more money to less money. And so it's kind of, there is no satiation to money. It doesn't become aversive when you have more of it, usually. And it has the strength of what I've shown you, for example. So we can use a task that is completely unrelated to the trauma in individuals with PTSD and still reveal something about their symptoms. So it's useful. At the same time, it's very different than a lot of the decisions that we make in real life. And we were interested in how we can study decisions that do not have quantifiable outcomes. People have studied decision-making under uncertainty with non-monetary outcomes. This is, for example, from Dino Levy and Paul Blimcher. This is from Kendra Seaman and Greg Samanes-Larkin. So they used money, food, water, medicine, But as you see, all of the outcomes are quantitative. So instead of $20, we now have 20 M&Ms or 20 milliliters of water, but there's still numbers that we can plug in a model and do some calculations on. We asked what happens when the outcomes are completely qualitative. And we presented our subjects this scenario. This is also work by Ron and Gia in my lab. They had to imagine that they were in this car accident. They suffered spinal injury, lost control of their legs, and then had to choose between different treatments. Otherwise, they would remain paralyzed. And the structure of the experiment was very similar to our monetary experiment because we wanted to also be able to compare monetary and medical decisions. And so again, risk and ambiguity, except now the choice was always between a slight improvement for sure versus taking some chance for a better improvement. Now the improvements were described verbally, and we worked with a physician on coming up with these descriptions, which you can read. So basically the subjects know what is the outcome that they would they can expect if they choose one treatment or another. And the first thing we did is simply looked at how many choices, on how many trials they chose these uncertain outcomes. And you see that subjects are pretty similar in the medical and monetary domain. So when we increase the probability for a good outcome, they choose it more. They also showed ambiguity aversion. So what I plot here, ambiguity aversion increases as a function of the level of ambiguity. So subjects prefer to avoid ambiguous treatments just as they prefer to avoid ambiguous monetary options. Interestingly, if you look at correlations across domains, there is significant correlation. So this is the risky choices in the monetary and medical domain, and similarly, ambiguous choices in the monetary and medical domain. There is significant correlation, but it's not a hugely strong correlation. So suggesting that there is some common attitude across domain, but also probably variations that are domain specific. But then the question is, if we want to continue studying it, how do we model qualitative values, right? If we want to do what we did before, get a compact representation of behavior using it in the neural analysis and so on, using the model that we had before is problematic because before we could plug in the amount, it was a number. Now we have a qualitative outcome. What do we do with it? And this is work, we have some initial results for this work where Ronan has tried different models to deal with this. And what seemed to be working is that instead of having this amount with the risk attitude attached to it, she could simply have a separate variable for each outcome level. So not assume anything. We tried several assumptions and so on, but without assuming anything, just getting these values as additional fitted parameters from the model seemed to work pretty well. She could then, this is just plotting the subjective value as function of the outcome level in the monetary and medical domains. And it seems pretty reasonable. Those of you who are familiar with the curvature of the utility function, we get it here. It seems pretty similar to what we would get if we assumed said curvature, but here we didn't assume anything. And when you compare choices across domains or the model fitted parameters across domains, there isn't a difference between the medical and monetary ambiguity attitudes. And there is actually nice correlation, a relatively nice correlation between the attitudes in the two domains. So it's possible to use models for this kind of qualitative, non-quantitative decisions. And to do this, and I'm not showing it here, but the next thing that you can do with this is just what we did with the monetary. So look for neurobiological correlates in fMRI, structural MRI experiments. Okay, and that's the last thing, just to show that we've also asked people explicitly at the end of the experiment, what is your estimate of the probability in all of these ambiguous outcomes, right? So we can estimate the probability from the behavior, from how they chose, but we can also, they're humans, we can also ask them. And we asked them, and our model did pretty well, was kind of significantly correlated with what they told us, but not very strongly correlated. And we can talk about it more. I think that's potentially interesting. Of course, we still don't have enough validation that the model is good, but if the model is good and if it describes behavior very well, it is possible that subjects do one thing, but think something else. So their choices not necessarily rely on their estimations, on their conscious estimations of probability. Okay. So to sum up everything, I hope I convinced you that the behavioral economics distinction between risk and ambiguity is useful in psychiatry and neurobiology research. There is some evidence for risk attitude as a trait. We still don't know about ambiguity. But we do have several pieces of evidence for the role of ambiguity or the association between ambiguity attitudes and psychopathology. And there are some interesting changes in value encoding in trauma-related psychopathology that I would love to continue. And that's what we're trying to do now, continue studying it. And then finally, I have to thank all the many people that work on this, my lab, especially Ron and Gia, Michael, who's a wonderful collaborator, several other collaborators, especially from the West Haven VA and the National Center for PTSD. And thank you. Sure. Changes or severity? Do you notice change? That's a great question. We really don't have the data. We looked at this and very small numbers, but actually some of them are very that would help drive the part of example, increased ambiguity. Oh, sorry. If increased aversion to ambiguous losses is a predisposition for PTSD, I would expect it to maybe not change. But if it's a result of symptoms, maybe with improvement, it would change as well. So it's a very interesting question. Yes. That's also a great question. So first, just to make sure that we're clear, when I say ambiguity, it's a very narrow definition of ambiguity. And I think you might be talking about a more general definition of what we would call ambiguity in everyday life, which is also an interesting direction that we're thinking of. We're just thinking of ambiguity is when the probabilities of different outcomes are unknown. And when I plot the ambiguity attitudes, it's just the difference of what people do when the probabilities are not known compared to what they would do if they knew that the probability is 50%. So in that sense, people who are not affected by ambiguity, they do what you're saying. They treat the ambiguous situation as a risky and not an ambiguous situation. And it's also an interesting question because one of, I think, the limitations of this paradigm is that in real life, you don't, I mean, there are limited circumstances where you get really precise probabilities like we do in the lab. So I think ambiguity is much more related to real life behavior.
Could the increased risk aversion be associated with typical increase in conscientiousness, the personality trait of conscientiousness? With aging, has anyone looked at conscientiousness and
That's a good question. First of all, just generally, I mean, it might be related to many changes with age that we did not control for. I don't know. Michael, do you know if there is any? Yeah, yeah. So I don't know. That's a good question.
Thought about moving that gray bar so that it's clear that one outcome is more likely. We're just not exactly sure. Why is it always that?
Yeah, that's also a good question. There are some studies that did this, that moved it. We did try a little bit of this, but haven't really pursued it just because it's more, so if it's not 50-50, then the level of ambiguity is limited, right? If it's, but I agree. And there is some indication that when ambiguity is around, that there is kind of a more complex pattern. So when ambiguity is around smaller or larger probabilities, not 50%, there is, I think, less ambiguity aversion, but depending on the amounts as well. And there is also interesting work kind of related to what you're asking from Uma Carmarker on giving information when you have an ambiguous option, giving information about the positive or the negative outcomes affects behavior differently. Mhm. Thank you.